questi che vediamo. Il Papa legge sul loro volto l'angoscia. Osserviamo, stringe le mani. Ecco la bambina.
What if behind every missing poster, every tearful press conference, and every desperate plea for help, there lies something darker, something bound not by chance, but by ritual, silence, and power? The disappearance of 3-year-old Madeleine McCann in 2007 has never simply been a story of loss. From the very beginning, whispers of hidden networks, secret societies, and carefully constructed narratives have hovered around her name like a shadow that refuses to fade. In the days after her vanishing from apartment 5A in Praia da Luz, Portugal, the world was flooded with sympathy. Politicians spoke out, celebrities donated, and the media amplified every image of her wide-eyed innocence. But beneath the polished headlines and the polished shoes of those in power, a different story was taking shape. One that did not ask how a little girl could vanish in the night, but who might have wanted her to disappear, and why. The theory of the Red Shoe Club, a rumored society tied to elites and occult rituals, may sound like fantasy, yet it became one of the most persistent whispers in forums, blogs, and alternative investigations. Linked symbolically to the color of blood and innocence lost, red shoes were said to mark allegiance to hidden circles of influence. To some, this was only digital myth-making. To others, it was the key to understanding why a case that should have been solved long ago remains tangled in contradictions. In 2008, computer-generated e-fit sketches of a man seen carrying a child on the night Madeleine disappeared reignited these suspicions. For some, the faces bore a chilling resemblance to well-known political operatives. For others, the resemblance was pure coincidence. But what cannot be denied is the firestorm of controversy these images unleashed, and how quickly the official narrative seemed to step aside, leaving a vacuum that conspiracy theories rushed in to fill. When the e-fit images were released in 2008, they were meant to spark new leads in the search for Madeleine. Instead, they lit a fire of suspicion that spread far beyond the borders of Portugal. Among online communities and independent investigators, a startling claim began to emerge. The sketches bore a resemblance to Tony and John Podesta, high-profile political figures deeply embedded in the corridors of power. The comparison was fueled by facial structure, hairlines, and other small features that some insisted could not be ignored. Websites and forums began to circulate side-by-side images, asking if the resemblance was truly coincidence, or if it pointed towards something far more sinister. Though no official authority in Portugal or the UK ever identified the Podestas as suspects, the lack of direct denial only made the speculation grow. The absence of clarity became its own fuel, allowing theories to thrive in the empty spaces left by investigators. Soon, whispers became louder. Alternative narratives claimed the Podesta brothers were in Portugal in May 2007, staying in a friend's villa not far from the Ocean Club resort where Madeleine vanished. No airline records, border stamps, or surveillance footage ever confirmed this, yet the rumor endured. It did not need documents to survive. It thrived on suggestion, on the psychological pull of needing a face to attach to the unanswered questions. In conspiracy literature, this detail became a cornerstone, a possibility too tantalizing to dismiss and too ambiguous to prove. The story deepened with the arrival of another infamous theory, Pizzagate. In 2016, leaked emails from John Podesta, released by WikiLeaks, were combed through with a microscope by internet sleuths. Harmless references to cheese pizza were reinterpreted as coded language for child exploitation. Though the FBI and multiple investigative bodies dismissed these interpretations as baseless, the images of powerful men linked to coded messages at odd hours of the night resonated deeply with a public already disillusioned by political secrecy. For many, the overlap between Madeleine's disappearance, the Podesta name, and the symbolic undertones of the Red Shoe Club created a narrative that was impossible to fully untangle. It was not about evidence in a courtroom sense. It was about perception, about the haunting feeling that too many strange coincidences were aligning. Critics argued this was nothing more than confirmation bias, internet users seeing patterns where none existed. But the sheer scale of the Madeleine case meant that even questionable leads could not simply vanish. Every time investigators dismissed them, the silence was read as proof of something being hidden. Every unanswered question became a breeding ground for deeper suspicion. At the heart of this speculation was a disturbing implication, that the McCann case had brushed against people of such influence and power that the truth could never be spoken openly. Whether or not the Podesta brothers ever set foot in Praia da Luz, their names became enshrined in the mythology of the case, not as proven suspects, but as symbols of how the story had grown larger than one missing child. By now, the mystery was no longer only about what happened to Madeleine. It was about whether the systems designed to uncover truth could function when the trail led too close to the powerful. As the years passed and official investigations failed to deliver closure, one of the most unsettling theories began to surface: that Madeleine was not the victim of a random intruder, but of a prearranged transaction. This idea, disturbing as it is, finds its roots in details that seem to defy logic when examined closely. Inside apartment 5A, Madeleine's bed placement was a critical clue. She slept in the bed closest to the door, while her younger twin siblings rested in cribs further from the exit. For anyone entering with the intent to abduct, the logical choice would have been the twins. They were smaller, quieter, and far less likely to resist. Yet Madeleine, the older, more vocal child, was taken. This choice, analysts argue, suggests not a spur-of-the-moment crime, but a deliberate selection. Why her? The unsettling answer may lie in testimony overheard at the Ocean Club. A staff member recalled a conversation between Kate and Jerry McCann in which words like vulnerable, cute, and superior were allegedly used to describe Madeleine. To most parents, such language would feel alien, cold, even transactional. But in the darker world of illicit adoption or trafficking, such terms align with the language of valuation, the way one might describe a commodity rather than a child. Further fueling suspicion was the way Kate and Jerry spoke about Madeleine in interviews. Linguistic experts noted their frequent use of detached, objectifying language, referring to her as the child or our daughter, instead of calling her by name. Forensic linguistics suggests that such distancing can reflect suppressed guilt, emotional detachment, or concealment. While grief manifests differently for every parent, the consistent pattern raised eyebrows among investigators and the public alike. Perhaps the most shocking claim tied to this theory is the allegation that Madeleine was sold for $5 million to wealthy buyers, possibly facilitated by intermediaries connected to shadowy networks. No evidence of bank transfers or direct witnesses supports this accusation, yet its persistence reveals something deeper: the public's instinct to fill the gaps left by an incomplete investigation. When timelines are unclear, when evidence is ignored, when authorities appear hesitant, suspicion takes root. The figure of $5 million has been repeated across forums, blogs, and underground narratives, not because it was proven, but because it symbolizes the belief that a high-stakes deal was made. Even the McCann's behavior after Madeleine's disappearance has been viewed through this lens. Instead of withdrawing from the spotlight, they launched a massive global campaign, raised millions in donations, and appeared regularly in interviews and documentaries. To some, this was a desperate attempt to keep her memory alive. To others, it was a carefully orchestrated public relations strategy, a way to control the narrative and deflect suspicion. No signs of forced entry were ever found in apartment 5A. The shutters were intact, and the patio door was often left unlocked. Combined with the choice of child and the peculiarities of language, the circumstances suggest access without resistance, a removal that may have been planned in advance rather than improvised in the dark. If this was not a random abduction, then it was something far more calculated and far more chilling. In criminal investigations, physical evidence is often the one thing that cannot be shaped by public relations, media narratives, or political influence. Yet, in the case of Madeleine McCann, even the forensic trail raises more questions than it answers. One of the most startling details is what investigators did not find. In Madeleine's own bed, where she was supposed to have slept on the night she vanished, there were no conclusive traces of her DNA. No hairs, no saliva stains, no epithelial cells on the sheets or pillow. For any 3-year-old child, such absence is almost unthinkable. Children shed biological traces naturally and abundantly. The void suggested not only an anomaly, but possibly a scene that had been cleaned or staged. Where traces did appear, however, they painted a chilling picture. Months after Madeleine disappeared, British authorities brought in 2 highly trained dogs. Eddie, a cadaver dog trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, and Keela, a blood detection dog capable of finding even minute traces. Their reactions were unambiguous. Both alerted behind the living room sofa in apartment 5A in the parents' rental car, and even on Madeleine's favorite stuffed toy, the cuddle cat, which Kate McCann was often photographed holding during press appearances. The implications were staggering. If Madeleine had been abducted by a stranger and never returned, how could cadaver scent and partial DNA have ended up in a car rented by the McCanns weeks after her disappearance? If the toy Kate clutched in grief carried the scent of death, what did that say about its contact before being displayed to the world as a symbol of hope? Critics pointed to the case of Chris Watts in the United States in 2018, where cadaver dog alerts played a key role in uncovering the truth of a family murder. In that case, law enforcement treated the dog's reactions as credible leads and pursued them relentlessly. Within days, Watts confessed. In contrast, in the McCann case, Scotland Yard downplayed the dog's findings, arguing that such evidence was not admissible on its own, and that the DNA results were inconclusive due to mixed samples. Technically, they were correct, but technical truths can sometimes be used to mask uncomfortable realities. What was not explained was why such consistent alerts across multiple objects and locations were not pursued with equal seriousness. Why were they treated as peripheral rather than central in a case so starved for physical evidence? The unanswered questions grow heavier with each detail. Why was there no forced entry? Why did the cadaver scent appear in places tied directly to the McCann's possession? Why was Madeleine's supposed sleeping space so sterile, while other objects spoke so clearly to death and concealment? Dogs do not lie. They do not bend to politics, media pressure, or sympathy campaigns. They react, or they do not. In this case, they reacted again and again. The silence that followed was not the silence of science, but of people choosing what truths the world was allowed to hear. Beyond the evidence and the theories, there is another element that makes the Madeleine McCann case so unnerving: the silence of those who were there. The group known as the Tapas Seven, friends and fellow holidaymakers who dined with Kate and Jerry on the night Madeleine vanished, have maintained a level of consistency in their statements that investigators find highly unusual. Each of the 7 gave interviews, each was questioned under pressure, and yet their testimonies aligned with near-perfect precision. They described a rotation system in which each adult left the table at intervals to check on their sleeping children. The order, the timing, even the smallest details seemed to match. To the untrained eye, such consistency might look reassuring, but to behavioral analysts it was a red flag. Human memory under stress is messy. Small contradictions are normal. When 7 people tell the exact same story for nearly 2 decades, without deviation, it begins to look rehearsed. The most striking silence surrounds Dr. David Payne, a close friend of the McCanns and the last known person, besides Kate and Jerry, to have allegedly seen Madeleine alive. A family acquaintance, Catherine Gaspar, gave a statement claiming Payne once made deeply unsettling remarks and gestures about Madeleine, remarks that disturbed her enough to submit a sworn affidavit. Yet, despite the gravity of the allegation, no formal investigation into Payne was ever pursued by British police. Since 2007, he has vanished from the public eye, absent from interviews, press conferences, or documentaries. His disappearance from the narrative raises as many questions as Madeleine's disappearance itself. Why would a group of educated professionals, doctors, medical staff, socially independent individuals, maintain such airtight silence for 16 years? 2 explanations dominate. The first is the loyalty pact theory, that if something accidental occurred that night, such as a tragic fall or a mistake with medication, the group chose solidarity over exposure. Protecting the McCanns meant protecting themselves from collateral blame. The second is the blackmail pact, that one or more members stayed silent not out of loyalty, but out of fear. fear of reputational ruin, loss of professional licenses, or darker consequences tied to secrets too damaging to reveal. What chills investigators and the public alike is not just the lack of answers, but the lack of cracks. No member of the Tapas Seven has broken ranks. No anonymous confession has surfaced. No slip in memory, no whispered contradiction. Their silence feels less like the absence of knowledge and more like the presence of control. And in that silence may lie the key to understanding what truly happened to Madeleine McCann. From the very start, the Madeleine McCann case was treated unlike almost any other missing child investigation in modern history. Within days, it had the attention not just of local police, but of the highest levels of the British government. Gordon Brown, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and soon-to-be Prime Minister, personally contacted Portuguese authorities to ensure cooperation with the McCanns. Later, in 2011, Prime Minister David Cameron authorized Operation Grange, a taxpayer-funded reinvestigation by Scotland Yard that would ultimately cost over $13 million. Such direct involvement of political leadership in an overseas case was extraordinary. In countless other child disappearances, grieving families struggle for years to reopen investigations. Why then did the McCanns receive such rapid, sustained support? Was it simply the result of public sympathy amplified by relentless media coverage, or was something deeper at stake? Operation Grange itself became a focal point of suspicion. Though it was presented as a fresh review from scratch, critics noted how narrowly it focused on the abduction theory, sidelining alternative explanations. The alerts from cadaver and blood detection dogs, the forensic anomalies, and the troubling behavioral cues were quietly downplayed. Instead, the official narrative emphasized the image of a shadowy intruder, keeping the McCanns firmly in the role of victims rather than potential suspects. At the same time, the British press displayed an unusual level of uniformity. Major outlets framed the couple sympathetically, often dismissing alternative theories as insensitive or conspiratorial. When Portuguese detective Gonçalo Amaral published his book, The Truth of the Lie, accusing the McCanns of concealing Madeleine's death, he was met with lawsuits and character attacks. Internationally, the coverage was more varied. German police, for instance, openly declared in 2020 their belief that Madeleine was dead. But within the UK, the media voice remained strikingly consistent, almost protective. The result was a wall, political, legal, and media-driven, around the McCanns. Whether this shield was built out of genuine belief in their innocence, or whether it served to protect larger interests, remains one of the most haunting questions of the case. In the absence of transparency, suspicion thrives. And so, as the years passed, the mystery became less about what happened to a little girl in Portugal, and more about why so many powerful forces seemed determined to shape the story we were allowed to hear. In the end, what lingers most about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann is not just the absence of answers, but the presence of silence. 16 years of unanswered questions, conflicting narratives, and evidence left unexplored have transformed this case into more than a personal tragedy. It has become a mirror reflecting how power, perception, and fear can shape justice. From the very first hours in apartment 5A, when the crime scene was compromised, to the coordinated testimonies of the Tapas Seven, to the overwhelming media narrative that painted one version of truth while burying others, every stage of this story warns us of how fragile truth can be. When public sympathy is orchestrated, when governments intervene with unusual force, when evidence from trained dogs and forensic tests is minimized rather than pursued, we are left with the haunting suspicion that what is missing is not only a child, but also the courage to confront uncomfortable realities. 3 lessons stand out clearly. First, that the integrity of a crime scene must never be sacrificed, no matter the emotional chaos of the moment. Second, that when 7 adults maintain identical testimonies for nearly 2 decades without a single contradiction, it is not a sign of honesty, but of coordination. And third, that when media power overtakes forensic fact, the story becomes controlled not by evidence, but by influence. Time does not erase truth. It only buries it deeper. Perhaps one day, a single breakthrough, a confession, or a hidden piece of evidence will surface, bringing clarity to the mystery that has haunted the world. Until then, the silence remains. But silence, as history shows, is never permanent. One day it will crack, and when it does, the truth about Madeleine McCann may finally speak.